How many of you have read the book Help, Thanks, Wow by Ann La Mott? It's a Whether or not you can be here for all of the sermon series that we're doing, or whether you can just take the book home and read it. It's a fabulous book and a great book to read in November, the Thanksgiving month. So I'm happy this morning. I'm really glad to be able to speak on help and also to hear Psalm 121. Although I remember it in the King James Version, when I lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence does my help come? My help comes. Having to memorize that with my grandfather. He gave me $1 for every psalm I read and memorized. This psalm is a psalm of ascent, as Walter Brueggemann reminds us, and it was probably written by a traveler on the way to Jerusalem. I'm sorry that my mic keeps, I think, coming in and out. Is that right? I'm going to hope that all things will be well really soon. I imagine someone walking in. I've been to Jerusalem many times, and I imagine someone walking in along a countryside road, tired, road weary and worn out from the walk, hot in the Middle Eastern sun, sitting down on the path and lifting her eyes to those hills around Jerusalem. Then feeling in that moment when she lifts her eyes to the hills, a little bit of strength to go forward, to get helped along a road a little bit further down the way. Help, I think, is these days. Help is the perfect prayer for these days. I visited with a beloved parishioner this past week and asked one simple question: when will
There might be a problem with the wire.
Do you mind?
Can you put the wire completely behind your arm?
Excuse me while I get ready to preach.
Okay, sorry.
We're always glad for these moments, aren't we? Let's see if that works.
That doesn't work.
Okay, we'll put this here. Okay, great. So I visited with a beloved parishioner earlier this week, sat in her living room, and she asked this very simple question: how are we to live in the midst of all this chaos? How are we to live in the midst of all this chaos? And it's true. I believe we live in a wild world, don't you? A country where we cannot get our government to function for the good of the people. And even though we're drowning in startups and Twitter and Facebook and all those other amazing things, we can't seem to get our national health care website to function. I don't get it. We'll be talking about guns and violence at 11 o'clock with Michael McBride. It will be a remarkable moment. And I will simply say here about talking about guns and violence, if there ever was a cry of help to be had, this is it. This is the moment to cry for help. I don't think I can handle another headlines about children being killed by a firearm. I don't know if I can go through another Newtown, and yet we cannot get our leaders to regulate on gun control. What's up with that? We ask the question again. There's an ongoing sense of chaos all around us as institutions seem to be going through massive and demanding changes at every level of community and society. No wonder we feel a sense of anxiety and uncertainty. We live in anxious, uncertain times. And now this morning, we woke up to the news that the Philippines tsunami, 10,000 dead, at least 10,000 dead. And we know that we'll hear more about that and more to come. So help, I think, is the perfect response to all of that. If you know anything about sailing, you know that SOS, although it is a Morse code, many people interpret SOS to be save our ship. I think SOS is the human cry for help. Save our souls. Save me. I may be going down. When my sister and I were very young women, We went for a hike one glorious afternoon in the Marin Headlands. It was beautiful. It was probably a spring day. It's a long time ago now, but I'm sure it was a spring day, and we went up beyond the Golden Gate for a hike, and we began walking on those curvy trails all around and beyond. About halfway through, I decided that I'd pull up into one of those little kind of rivets where the bushes protect you and you can curl into a ball and feel the sun on your face and take a nap in the sun. My sister went on and walked away from me, and this is what happened while I was sleeping. She walked for a ways, and at one point on the cliff, her foot slipped, and then her entire body went down the hill. And she felt herself going down a cliff head first and couldn't find anything. The water was below, she was hanging on the side of the cliff, and she knew and felt that this was the last moment of her life. She was terrified. And just at the moment when she knew she was going to fall off the cliff and down into the water, her foot caught on a rock. It was a really small rock. She was so thankful that it was stable. And she stood there for a moment and reports that in that moment she said, "Help me, help me." And as she stabilized, she very carefully reached her hand up and caught on to some weeds. And on her belly, parallel to the cliff, began slowly climbing her way up the cliff and out of that despair. I was taking a nap. I woke up and I looked back to see if she was on that path and forward to see if she was coming after me on that path. I did not look down. There was no way in the world I would have thought that my sister could have fallen. She's 6 feet tall and a lot stronger than me, those of you who know her. So as I waited, I saw finally in front of me my sister crawling up through the weeds toward me. She had been walking and slipped, and I'd been sleeping. I had no idea. As she came towards me, I never have seen such a look on her face as that one. As she came towards me, she simply looked at me and in kind of a mew of a kitten said, "Help, help." I think she was talking to me, but I'm certain she was calling for God. I need to report that all was well, that I took her in my arms and we went home, and the funny part, or maybe a worse part than even the fall, was that she woke up the next morning and had poison oak from her tiptoes to the top of her head. Since that day, whenever I've been standing at the many cliff sides of my own life and hanging there, I've thought of my sister. I've thought of my sister, and I've whispered or cried or shouted help in the same way that Mary Beth did. And always, I think, some part of me, softly, loudly, desperately, is calling to God. I've whispered it before entering a quiet room when I know someone who I love will need the right words at the right moment in a vulnerable time. I've cried help when I've heard bad news with family or friends or members of this congregation. I cried out loud the moment, many of you may not remember this, but when we traveled in Iran, my husband Sam fell and hit his head on a marble floor, and I heard his head hit the floor, and in that moment, I cried, "Help." I even say it when I can't find my keys and it's late at night and I'm trying to get in the front door of my house and I can't seem to get in the house. Help! And I often say it, and many of you have heard me, not as a joke or in any way to be sacrilegious, but because it's an ancient, amazing phrase. And I hope that when I say that phrase, it might summon up a little extra power, a little courage in me. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus. The help prayer comes when we know we can't do it alone. It's that moment when we hit that place where I can't do it by myself. It comes when we're at the end of our ropes, hanging out at the bottom of a cliff, and we know that no human ear will hear us. But I resist. I resist saying help. Do you? I resist giving over that moment to God. I'm pretty good at reading maps, and so in our family, I'm the map reader. Sam laughs because he thinks I act like a man when it comes to maps. He says, I'll always ask for somebody's help. You'll never ask for somebody's help. I guess that's a male characteristic. Anyway, I don't like to ask for helps with maps because I know that when I ask, I'm going to get more confused than simply trusting myself, right? And staying in control, holding on. I'm the oldest child in my family, and I was taught as the oldest child to be the helper instead of the helpee. There are lots of nods here, lots of oldest children in the room. In my family, it was a sign of weakness to ask for help. We were Stoic, we were Calvinist, and we were Dutch. Put that together, we were taught to grin and bear it. Mostly we were taught not to grin, but always to bear it, right? I have learned over the years that I can't make it alone, and neither can any one of us. I can't make it alone, and neither can any one of us. First, I was taught to always be there for others, and that being there for others in the face of not being able to make it alone is kind of a twisty thing. But I think when you learn the lesson first about being there for others, it can be kind of addictive, right? There's a lot of power, there's a lot of control, there's a lot of energy in being the savior, the helper. But there comes a day when being that big helper just doesn't work anymore. We get tired, and let's face it, we sometimes get resentful, and the reward gets pretty thin if we're always helping and never asking for help. It can be exhausting. But there also might be, in the midst of all of those things, that moment when you figure out you need help. You're so used to giving it, but you need it. All that energy going out to others sets us up to fail. The moment that happens, the moment you realize you can't give another thing, is the moment you need help. And that's the moment that God enters in. About all these things, I think God already gets it. God knows and is a part of that moment of utter helplessness when every other thing is exhausted. Every other thing in your life is exhausted. And only God can get in there. I think about that moment on the cross, one of the profound moments on the cross when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I think in that moment, it was a dark and lonely cry for help. And when I remember, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's Jesus crying out in a relationship. Jesus doesn't feel really forsaken at that moment. Jesus is in a relationship with God, still reaching out, still crying for help. I think that this moment is God's good and most truthful moment with us. When we've left everything else, there's nothing else to hang on to, and we get to crawl up from whatever cliff we've been hanging off of. Help me, help. When we cry out for help, Ann La Mott says, or whisper it in our chests, we enter into the paradox of not going limp and not feeling so hopeless that we can barely walk and we release ourselves in that moment from the absolute craziness. It's crazy to try to make it on our own or to be another person's higher power. God is our highest, our lowest, our in-between power. Help. When we come to that prayer, when we reach the end and are ready to move and to begin again with courage and strength from that someone, somewhere, to move beyond this moment into the next one, it's the moment we can stop those feelings of control, superiority, panic, and anxiety that is a part of all of us and around all of us. We catch our toes on that rock, and we begin to crawl up again, sometimes on our bellies, one handful of weeds at a time, but up and out and home again, into a life that will always be a little deeper, a little better, a little stronger, a little wiser, because we've cried, help. Amen.